You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. During this election year, I've spent a lot of time on the road, speaking with American voters and reporting their stories. I've also caught up with a few friends during my travels. We've shared a drink, traded war stories from covering previous elections, and predicted what we might see November 5th. One colleague particularly stands out, Mike Madrid, veteran political consultant and author of The Latino Century. In late October, Mike and I met in Boston as featured guests of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, and using his book as a jumping-off point, we talked about transforming democracy in the Latino century.
The party that's going to be the dominant political party of the next generation is going to be the party that is able to capture the hearts, minds, and votes of a multi-ethnic working class. Democrats have a real problem with the working class right now, and it's been going on for the better part of a decade. They don't believe they are, but the working class is telling them very loudly, we're not with you anymore.
Listening back to Mike's pre-election analysis, it's clear he had his finger right on the pulse of the electorate. Democrats have a big problem with working-class voters. Trump's economic message is connecting with a multiracial voting group, including Latino voters. After digging into the post-election data, perhaps the most surprising stat is that Donald Trump collected 46% of Latinos, 55% of men. In the daylight of the election results, I checked back in with Mike Madrid so we could square our assumptions going into the election and why Trump performed so strongly with Latino voters. Mike Madrid is a nationally recognized political consultant with an expertise on Latino voting trends and voter behavior. Madrid has been a pioneer in Latino communications and outreach strategies in state, local, and national political campaigns. In 2020, Madrid co-founded the Lincoln Project. He's author of the recent book, The Latino Century, and he co-hosts the Latino Vote podcast. Mike Madrid, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Ray, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
When we last spoke, in front of a live audience just a few weeks ago in Boston, Massachusetts, at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, could you have imagined the results coming out of Election Day?
I'm surprised by the size of the shift, but not that the shift was happening. Again, as we discussed, this has been over a decade in the making. This has been happening for a long time. What we're witnessing right now is as the Latino vote gets larger, the numbers are going to continue to compound. So I'm surprised at the size of it, but certainly not the direction of it.
You told our audience that we were in the midst of a transition of Latino voters, from a racially or ethnically determined voter to more of a class-determined voter. Did the numbers that you've seen coming out of Election Day bear out that analysis?
From what we have so far, yes, overwhelmingly. And again, I hesitate to say, I predicted this, but the demographics have been very clear for, like I said, well over a decade now. And what we're witnessing is the explosion of later generations Latinos. These are third and now a discernible fourth generation Latino with a much weaker ethnic anchor. And both parties have been speaking very differently to these audiences for some time. And polling data for 3 decades now has said that economics, affordability, job opportunities are driving this part of the electorate. And as we move further away from the immigration experience, we can expect the party that focuses on these economic, populist, and pocketbook issues to be the beneficiary. And at the moment, that's the Republican Party.
Both parties are probably still running numbers and doing analysis and having internal conversations about what the election told them. Should they, both parties, conclude that what happened is a big deal?
I think it's a tectonic shift that's occurred that's going to challenge some of the basic assumptions of both parties. I think if the Republicans believe that this is some direct affirmation of the direction they've been going in for the past 8 years, They are missing the demographic change as much as the Democrats, who have been denying it's been happening for the past 8 years. And as we discussed in Boston together, this is a sign that both parties don't understand what is happening here. The emergence of a multi-ethnic, multiracial working class is going to challenge some of our basic American assumptions about who minorities are, how the working class votes, and what that's going to mean for the future of both political parties.
Now, we should point out that Donald Trump, though he made big inroads among male Latino voters, less so among women, he still lost the Latino vote. Are we looking at something that's kind of a transition that's still in motion? Are we looking at something that's still far from over? And that Democrats might be well advised to be getting ready for even bigger erosion in elections to come?
Well, Ray, as always, those are the exact right questions to be asking. The first is, let me say this, I don't believe this is a realignment. And the reason I say that is because a realignment presupposes that there are existing positions that are either changing or the parties are changing and reflecting more of a cultural representation or economic representation of these voters. There is very little evidence to suggest that Republicans or that Latinos are becoming more conservative. There's a lot of evidence to suggest Latinos are becoming more populist, that they're moving away from both parties. I also push back a little bit on those that would suggest this is a swingier vote. Again, a swing suggests this is moving between right or left. This is really the emergence of something very unique in American history, or at least for the last 150 years. And that, again, is a working class blue collar voter that is saying pocketbook and populist economic issues are where they want the focus and attention, when both parties are largely viewing non-white voters as a traditional minority, the way that we have known them for the better part of 250 years in this country. We're witnessing a real challenge to our basic language about how we understand non-white voters to be. And that, again, it puts both parties in a particular predicament. This group has the weakest partisan anchors of any ethnicity in the country. So for the moment, Democrats are losing voters, these Latino voters. I think it's a better way to characterize this exodus as leaving the Democratic Party more than it's going to the Republican Party, and it is absolutely reversible.
While I understand the case you have made and have been making against the Democratic Party when it comes to not really speaking to Latino voters, at the same time, I'm really not sure about the appeal this time around of the other side on the pandemic alone. I know for some people it seems like a long time ago, but Donald Trump, as president, lied to the country about what he already knew about the threat of COVID-19. Latinos were disproportionately burdened by both risk as essential workers and by death and illness as people less likely to have health insurance, less likely to have work-from-home style jobs, more likely to be forced to go back to work. Surely they remember that. It's not ancient history. Did the Democrats just not remind them?
No, but I think that the seeds of understanding are actually in the premise of your question to begin with. Is I don't believe that anybody, certainly not Latinos, buy the argument that COVID could have been contained purely by Donald being more truthful about what was happening first. That doesn't excuse his lies, his obvious lies. But the second and most important consideration is we called it the essential workforce, but it was overwhelmingly Latinos that were doing these jobs.
Exactly.
But the rationale becomes, if we're already out there and doing this, why are we the ones that are exposed and having our economic opportunities limited? We are the ones that kept the economy going for everybody else. And yet it was the Democrats, and this, again, I'm not saying I agree with this, I'm saying I understand this rationale. The Democrats were the ones that were keeping the economy closed and limiting opportunities, limiting income. These were not workers that were necessarily getting the same paychecks, the same government amounts of money, the same loans that didn't need to be repaid, but they had to expose their family to this virus. They were dying disproportionately and saying, why don't we, if we're all out there getting sick anyway as Latinos, we're not getting the benefits of being protected by COVID. We should at least get the financial rewards for it. And while I don't agree with the sentiment, I completely understand it.
People who are not Latino and people who haven't read your book think and have written and said on radio and television, some of them are even people who are considered experts. They've said some version of this. How, of all people, can Latinos consider Donald Trump as a viable alternative? Since he came down that golden escalator in 2015, he's demeaned, denigrated Latinos, called a U.S. federal judge a Mexican who could not adjudicate his case fairly, said immigrants don't love the country, said people who come to this country to work are killers and rapists and drug smugglers, promised during the 2024 campaign to begin mass deportations when he reaches the White House. Why would any Latinos vote for a guy like that?
I think those are all very valid questions, and those are all the questions I've asked myself over the course of the past 8 years, and it's why I wrote the book, was to provide some insight and understanding. I think the answer, Ray, is as simple as this. The fact that Donald Trump and others in this country are racist and have antipathy towards Latinos generally and the immigrant specifically, the undocumented even more specifically, is not a surprise to us. But none of that ameliorates the concerns of the fact that I've got to pay rent on Friday and I have hungry kids tonight, and I want to do the best I can to get ahead. And I think for those of us that have the luxury of not understanding that hand-to-mouth reality, this is unconscionable behavior. I understand that. But as somebody who grew up like that, somebody who experienced that and saw a very similar political transformation in my own family, which I write about in the book, I completely get it. I myself renounced the party that I spent 30 years in, the Republican Party. I have been against Donald Trump since that first day, but I felt compelled to write a book as a warning to let people know this was coming. This is emerging. This is the rationale behind it. And at least from my 30 years of perspective, this is the understanding of where blue-collar workers are at this moment in time. The idea that democracy is under a threat, misogyny exists, racism is real, are the luxuries of those people that don't have to worry about the hand-to-mouth existence of the fastest-growing segment of our working class.
So those things end up making less of a difference than, look, when who's president, am I going to get more overtime? See prices go up less, that kind of thing.
Well, let me say this. I think it's quantifiably true to say that the quality of life and the affordability of life for the first 3 years anyway under Donald Trump was far better than those under Joe Biden. That's just not debatable for working class people. Interest rates tripled under Joe Biden. In an industry where 1 in 5 Latino men work in the construction industry, that's a gut punch to the Latino economy. In the first 3 years, our currency devalued by 25%. That may not affect you if you drive a SUV or an electric car, but if you're working class and barely making it, week to week on a paycheck, you know what the price of gas is. And I think as this diploma divide continues to separate the college-educated from the non-college educated, the two worlds, the two realities of what it means to be a paycheck-to-paycheck person, to be a non-college educated laborer and worker, the distance of understanding becomes universes apart. And I think that's so much of why there's this inability to relate to people who have these economic circumstances and can't get over why the racism, the family separation, the building a wall isn't more important than making sure your kids get 3 square meals a day and are able to maybe join a soccer league as a luxury.
There's a hierarchy of values, and I would never suggest that respect is number one, but is it even in the basket? If you grew up in a family where people spoke English to varying degrees, I did, I know you did. If you grew up in a family where people struggled to be accepted and recognized as belonging, as neighbors, I did, I know you did. Though I'm not an immigrant myself, my antennae are very much attuned to what contempt and condescension sounds like. And I wondered, whether so many of the 65 million Latinos, and you alluded to this earlier, in America are removed enough from that experience that it doesn't enter the radar screen as one of the operating issues on which they're going to make their decision.
Yeah, that's, again, the right question. And let me say, just so people have an understanding of the perspective, I was motivated to, again, turn against Donald Trump and his party for precisely those reasons. And I don't make a justification for it. What I'm trying to do is suggest that all of the data has shown us, long before Trump, by the way, this movement away from the Democratic Party started before Donald Trump. Okay? This movement it coincides almost perfectly with the explosion of later generation US born Latinos who don't have that same ethnic tie. So for us to correlate the third and fourth generation, Mexican American who's never spoken Spanish with that of the recently migrated Venezuelan who speaks only Spanish and can't draw the correlation between the two is a failing on our side to articulate the differences between these two people who have tectonically different political perspectives. The short answer is yes, the dramatic growth of Latino voters is overwhelmingly US-born later generation voters who not only do not see Donald Trump as speaking about them, but in many ways, all of the polling was showing they agree with a lot of the border security comments that he's made, including deporting those that are here undocumented. One of the most fascinating things during Ron DeSantis and Governor Greg Abbott's sending migrants to Martha's Vineyard in Sacramento, California, was the high number of Latinos that were polled that agreed with those activities. Is they were saying we need to have border security as a primary objective as Americans. And my typical American identity is much stronger than my Latino identity. We can judge that, we can castigate it, but we can't deny that it's there.
I hear what you're saying. I understand the desire for, especially among insecure people, that their lives be not made more precarious, not be made more insecure. And at the same time, I wonder about whether they would worry that their own dealings with the state, that their own relationship to the government would ever be inhumane. That if you encourage government actions that seem inhumane, like family separation, like losing kids in the system, where that you as a relatively unempowered person might say, well, a government that can do that can, stop me because of the way I look, to check my driver's license, can frisk me on the street because they suspect that I'm a Mexican out of status here in Tucson, in Phoenix, in San Diego. That fellow feeling that might come not necessarily from your own personal history or even your immediate family's history, but a rising level of sensitivity to what people like me are up against, whether it's in East Los Angeles or the South Side of Chicago or one of the outer boroughs of New York City, which is now home to an enormous Latino population.
I'll take it a step further and say I think it's really more a question of humanity and humanitarian concerns rather than ethnic concerns. And I think that's why so many people are so morally offended, understandably. I get that. But let me offer two other pieces of information. We have to remember that in 2016, Donald Trump ran on one central campaign thematic. He was going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. He did neither of those things. And he was castigated rightfully as a racist, as a bigot, as somebody who was anti-immigrant and anti-Mexico. But the reality is those things never came to pass. What did come to pass was the ICE immigration crackdowns did begin to happen in Latino communities. And when the idea of the abstract Donald Trump became an existential threat to Latino communities, they did go to the polling place and vote against Donald Trump in record numbers. The 2018 midterms had the highest Latino midterm turnout in the history of the country, and it was overwhelmingly, decidedly against Donald Trump. So there is a history of responding and reacting to this when it does happen. But there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that Donald Trump is not believable on these issues and that he's more of an entertainer who should not be taken seriously, because on some of these issues, especially the central thematic that branded him this way, he did not follow through on it. He did not act on it. He did not follow through on that campaign promise. And Latinos, I think, are being given, two pieces of information, and they're trying to decide which it is best to believe at this point in time. I side with those that take Donald Trump very seriously. But again, at least if the data is to believe, almost half of us believed the opposite.
Unidos US, perhaps remembered by some in the audience as the National Council of La Raza, just released the American Elections Poll. And as part of the summary of what they found in the numbers, they wrote this: Latino voters were not instrumental in the Trump victory. If no Latino had cast a ballot, the outcome would be unchanged. This is true at the national level and likely every battleground state. However, had Latinos voted in ways similar to earlier elections, they may have prevented several states from flipping, though it is less clear they could have reversed the outcome. You're a stat guy, you're a data guy, you're an analysis guy. How does that sound to you?
It sounds completely off base. And I say that with a lot of heartbreak, because Unidos US awarded me their Capital Award last year. These are dear friends of mine, and Unidos US is the longest serving Latino civil rights organization in this country. But they have been, for a whole host of reasons, promulgating bad data related to the outcomes of elections, and it needs to stop and it needs to end. That same report was suggesting essentially that there was very little erosion that happened with Latino voters in the 2024 election. That is quantifiably not true. The same reports with the same researchers were issued in the post-2020 election. There's this denial that has set in with some of the loudest Latino advocacy organizations about what is obvious to everybody else. And if we're going to believe in math and science and truth, we need to stop being persuaded by consultants and pollsters and contractors to lead us down the path of partisanship and start looking at the accurate numbers to be honest about what we all can see with our own eyes and know in our own families and is evident in everybody else's data.
There's like a good 10% difference in this poll and AP's exit polls that show Donald Trump breaking 40%, which is usually the success threshold for Republican candidates with Latinos. Are these voters particularly hard to count for pollsters?
Not for a good pollster. That's credible. It's not just AP. The New York Times Siena poll has been consistently more accurate than these partisan pollsters have been for a decade. The same with Pew Research. The same with Edison Research. AP, as you just mentioned. Every objective analyst has looked at this data and concluded differently than what is being articulated from these Latino advocacy organizations who keep leading Democratic candidates down the path of ruin. In many ways, this shift, which has endangered the country, is a direct result of choosing partisan polling over objective data. And there needs to be a reckoning about whether or not this one polling firm that is advising these groups, why it is so wildly off from literally every other polling entity, every other academic researcher, every other institute that is saying this is happening, it's been happening, and the precinct data and the math shows it. And there's going to have to be an honest conversation in the Latino community about who we are, what that means, and what we're willing to advance in terms of either the community's representation or partisan advantage.
Do you think those kinds of self-comforting reports, let's call it that, delay the moment of reckoning, mislead organizations that ought to be making some decisions about how to change their posture, and delay them actually coming up with some new ideas?
That's 100% of what's going on. Remember, these same organizations and these same pollsters denied that this happened in 2016 when the Democrats were saying they were going to win Florida because of the Latino vote, and they lost it. This is the same polling outfit that did the same thing in 2020 with the same organization saying the exact same thing. They did it again just a couple of days ago in 2024, 3 election cycles in a row. Democrats have lost Latino voters, not just to Republicans, but to Donald Trump. Think about that. That's a 5-alarm fire. If you can't fix that, it's because you're clearly being misled by the data. And the reason is because these folks are much more interested in reinforcing their own pre-existing biases. I'd hate to say it's about securing contracts and money and title, but I've been in politics long enough to know that to follow something clearly this wrong for this long a period of time, there has to be something more troubling afoot. And it hurts me as a Latino advocate. It hurts me as a Latino data guy that's been looking at this for 3 decades. This has been quantifiably wrong. And none of this had to happen. And it should stop going forward because somebody needs to raise their hand and say, this is not true. The emperor has no clothes. We all know it. It's time to get back to honest data and honest discussion and get back to the policies that the community is telling us they want us to prioritize.
Both candidates promised to lower prices starting in 2025. I'm not sure either victor could have done it because prices are not easily lowered in an economy like ours. Let's set that aside. The Democratic nominee talked about helping families afford to buy houses. The Democratic nominee was part of an administration that helped relieve the burden of tuition debt off the backs of millions of individual students, and we know that debt falls more disproportionately on low-income families, on Black and brown students. The Democrats were talking about those kinds of issues to voters of all kinds. How come they read as neglecting working-class voters?
That's a great question. And I think this is what causes, the most concern amongst Democrats. And the answer, I think, is very simply this. Lived experience is far more impactful and real than future hypotheticals. As I mentioned earlier, the life of and affordability of working class people was quantifiably, demonstrably better in the first 3 years of the Trump administration than it was in the first 3.5, 4 years of the Biden administration. Simply affordability, by just a pure affordability metric, which is what your prioritization is on that Maslow hierarchy of needs. So when you're telling me that Donald Trump is going to ruin the economy and create an inflationary cycle and is going to do everything bad, and yet the Democrats are saying, well, Kamala Harris is going to do everything good, the natural reaction is, why didn't they do that? Why haven't they done that? Why is recent memory for me that I experienced with my own understanding, my own life, with my own eyes and my own ears, not telling me that what you're saying is true? Life was better. It was more affordable economically, financially under Trump than it was under Biden and Harris. And yet the messaging I'm getting is Donald Trump is going to ruin the economy. It's going to make it worse for you, and his policies are bad for you. That flies in the face of the lived experience. And as a campaign professional, it's extremely difficult to make that contrast work when it's what people experienced with their own understanding and their own perspective of the world.
But we did have a once-in-a-century experience in this country, and the Biden administration had to suffer the downstream effects along with 335 million Americans.
That's the great unfortunate irony of this whole situation is so many people blame Joe Biden for the lasting effects of COVID. And that may be a function of it lasting too long or sheltering in place for too long of a period of time, or perhaps the realization and or belief wrongfully or rightfully that the coronavirus was not as dangerous as we were led to believe. All of the economic breakdown, I would lay at the feet of Donald Trump. There's no question in my mind. That's not the way working class voters see this. Not just Latinos, broadly, those that do not have college degrees broadly believe that this was overdone, overplayed, and the damage was too extensive by the Democrats in every level of government. And that's going to last a while. It's certainly the effects of it. Again, I don't blame Joe Biden for increased tripling of interest rates. He has nothing to do with that. The inflationary cycle that we went into was begun under the Trump administration by trying to inflate the economy and trying to prevent it from collapsing. There's no doubt from a policy perspective that there's policy ramifications from the actions that both parties took or did not take. But as Harry S. Truman famously said, the buck stops here. The way people are feeling during the administration is something that you have to take into account for as a political professional. You can't fix the problem until you can't be fixing the blame until you fix the problem. And the Biden administration got the downside of everything related to COVID economically and the way people felt about the direction of the country. One of the unfortunate dynamics is just as the economy is about to start taking off in a really positive direction, Biden and Harris will no longer be in the White House. Donald Trump will be able to take credit for a lot of this stuff.
Well, the phone rings. It's in the last couple of months of his tenure. Jamie Harrison, the chairman of the DNC, on the other end of the line, and he says, Mike, what should we do? What's your advice?
Well, one of the great ironies is, again, Kamala Harris did most of the things she needed to do. The problem is making the adjustment 100 days before the election is not possible to change 15 years of bad branding. I think the Democratic Party, frankly, they got the message 3 months before the election, but they had to change course. They changed 180 degrees direction on border security. Kamala Harris adopts a no taxes on tips economic plan very similar to Donald Trump's in response to this populist economic message. She launches a very aggressive housing policy. All of these things are good. This an opportunity economy that is about tax credit for providing employee ownership of companies. That's, first of all, that's Reaganomics. That's Jack Kemp policy, but they're getting it. They have figured it out. The problem is they have spent 15 years driving in the opposite direction, specifically on the immigration issue, telling the fastest growing segment of the Latino electorate that they aren't relatable, that they don't understand them. And I think now, finally, this course correction that Kamala Harris began will take root. And as largely a function of the economy, I think you're going to start seeing a potential mitigation if the Democrats continue on that route.
Mike Madrid, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground. Great to have you.
Ray, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for having me.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, a final election post-mortem from our week-to-week political program. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Commonwealth Club World Affairs is located in San Francisco, by reputation one of the nation's most liberal cities. And despite only about 7% of the city registering as Republican during the 2024 presidential election, Trump captured more than 15% of the vote in the progressive city. It's a sign Donald Trump also overperformed in, quote, Democratic bubbles. On November 5th, a day after Trump's victory, we hosted a special week-to-week program breaking down the results. It was hosted by John Zipperer, Vice President of Media and Editorial at Commonwealth Club World Affairs. We'll share an excerpt from that conversation. John takes it from here.
I'm John Zipper. I'm your host for Week to Week, and I'm also the Commonwealth Club's Vice President of Media and Editorial. I'm so glad to see all of you here today, as well as everyone watching and listening online. And first of all, everyone, take a deep breath. The election's over. We're here. We'll survive.
Over, but not certified yet.
Yes. Well, I'm also not a certified psychiatrist or anything. So I can't really offer grief therapy, but Now we all just get to witness all the recriminations and accusations over the next couple of months, at which point the 2028 race for the White House will kick off, I'm sure. So let's meet our panelists for tonight. They're all veterans of Week to Week. I'll just start right next to me and work down the line with Tim Anaya. He's the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at the Pacific Research Institute. He's also the co-author of the new book, The California Left Coast Survivor's Guide. Welcome, Tim. Next to him is attorney and political analyst Melissa Kane. Welcome back.
How we doing?
And last but not least, Joe Garofoli. He's the senior political writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, where he's also the host of the podcast It's All Political on Fifth and Mission. Hello again, Joe.
Hello.
Okay, let's start with the big headline. Obviously, Donald J. Trump is our next president. He was reelected. I guess, is that reelected when you have an interregnum there?
We've been arguing about Grover Cleveland since his second election.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still out there.
He's been elected again to the White House, this time, though, with a majority of the popular vote, as well as the electoral vote. Trump performed better with just about every group, just about every demographic. In fact, both genders. I mean, men and women. So I think maybe black women he didn't do well with, but I mean, everyone else. Let's get into some of these. I mean, Latinos, he won a much bigger share than before. What was it, like 45%?
45% of Latinos, which was higher than George W. Bush got in 2004, which was kind of the recent high mark. And he won 54% of Latino men.
He even performed better in San Francisco, as the Chronicle is reporting, at least based on the votes that we have so far. What did he have? Something like 16% versus 13%. I mean, it's not a ton, but it's bananas. I mean, this is Harris's hometown.
Republican registration is 7% for context. So he'd like double that.
And if you look across the country, kind of bigger cities across the country, it was a similar phenomenon of like a 4 to 8% bump.
And as the resident Marxist here, I saw at Kaiser Family Foundation, they do good polling, and they said, they were polling on abortion, and 45% of the people said abortion rights was a very important issue to them. But 63% or something said the high price of food was much more important, and gas was higher than that, and the cost of living. So, your daily life was more important. And, people looked back and said, well, who's been in charge the last 4 years? Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And she never did anything to differentiate herself. He was asked multiple times, what would you do differently than Biden? What policies would you step away from? She's like, no, I'm good. So people were like, well, I don't want any more of that.
In the national exit poll, which is very interesting, if you really want to do a dive, you can go online. It's easy to find. Biden had a 58% disapproval rating. Trump won 80% of those votes.
Wow, that's a good stat. Yeah.
Like I said, we're going to get weeks and maybe months of recriminations and accusations and wild theories. So I'm just going to get started right now. And one is just, did Biden help her or hurt her after he left the race? We all remember, the garbage comment and then her having to clean up after that. But overall, what's your sense of it? And maybe if you know anything, what are you hearing about it?
Well, initially, it helped her because she wasn't him, and he was the problem.
Yeah.
But then every time he sort of poked his head up, that's reason why he wasn't the nominee, because he was not effective at it. They basically said, you can go to Scranton and you can go to Philly and just otherwise, be president, do your day job.
I think when it comes to Biden, though, the big knock on him that's sort of evolving is that he stayed too long, right? That he should have dropped out earlier. And had he dropped out earlier, there may have been either more time for Kamala Harris to build support or time for there to be a mini primary so they could sort of shed some of the complaints about the lack of democratic process. And so this idea that his big problem, that his big the thing that he did to most hurt her wasn't the garbage comment. It was running, frankly, for re-election.
Running, which he said he was going to be a bridge to the next generation, but the bridge never came down until, 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. So we're going to see the Democrats, the circular firing squad has formed, and there's going to be so much finger pointing and blaming, and it's this and that. And we've already started to see it, and it's going to be an ugly few months.
I thought it was interesting, and this was a stat I saw in the exit polling. So, if you watch TV over the last week and kind of was following what was going on in the campaign, I think the conventional wisdom, right, was Harris had a good last week.
Yeah.
Trump had a bad last week. If you look at how did people who decided to vote in the last week decide, Trump won those voters. And then they asked, if you decided in the last few days, how did you vote? Trump won those voters too. So
nothing matters.
nothing matters? I don't think.
Yeah.
Well, Melissa, so having been right there, seeing voters all day long, I mean, what was, not to say the vibe, but I mean, what were you getting from them? I mean, what was your sense of the ground game, actual at the polling place? For those of us who vote by mail, we missed that.
It was really beautiful, actually. People were earnestly and unironically excited to do a thing that they believed was helpful for the world, for the country, for their community. And you never saw people so excited to get an I voted sticker. Like they would come back and go, can I get one more for my, and they would just, all right, I want the whole world to know I did a thing. And so people were excited to do it, it seemed to me. And it felt like it was really important, even though, and look, I'm never going to, get down on that. But the idea that, that Kamala Harris wasn't going to win California, I was like, okay, like you were helpful, but, it wasn't like it was, hit or miss here in California. But it was really lovely to see people excited to do this, of course, to some degree out of fear, because they really felt like, and there were people who would come in and say, well, this is the last one, and then cast their vote and drop it off and say, well, I wanted to be here because might be the last election we have. They were really scared. So really motivated and excited to be there.
Something that's apparently going to happen regardless of who won this election is that later this month, Donald Trump will be sentenced. Is this something that he can overturn or in any way have the Justice Department overturn when he does get in? In other words, is this...
Can he pardon himself?
Cases,
Right.
Yeah. Can he...
We'll see.
Yeah.
We don't actually
You're the
know.
expert on this.
Yes.
There is y'all should check this out. So the U.S. Supreme Court has a podcast where you can listen to all the oral arguments.
Cool.
Kind of interesting. But if you listen to the one on Trump's immunity, Judge Gorsuch starts getting into, can the president pardon himself? And so he actually sort of gives it's very quick, but it's there, and expresses some skepticism about that. So I don't know that his guys are going to go for what he's selling there in terms of being able to pardon yourself. I can tell you there was no discussion of that in the constitutional, Congress records of whether or not that should be a thing when they gave the pardon power to the president, that was ever a thing that they ever imagined anyone would do, that the people would never elect someone who would do such a thing. But here we are. So I'm not sure if that's going to fly. It will absolutely be litigated till, the cows come home. But will he try? You betcha. With the federal ones. Now, remember, it's only for federal crimes. So state crimes he could still be prosecuted for. He couldn't necessarily
So he still might go to jail for a parking ticket, but
not sexual assault.
And related to that, apparently Jack Smith is looking to wind down his prosecutions of Trump on the assumption that once Trump is president, that the Justice Department will adhere to its longstanding position that you can't prosecute a sitting president. I mean, Trump's won a number of victories this week, really.
Yeah.
We have our first batch of questions from the audience, and they're great questions, by the way. One person writes, why? Why? Why?
Can we hug that person?
Yes.
Someone else asks, will the Democrats realize and address the issue that some of their policies are disliked?
Well,
They lost
I think
now,
the voters are speaking of those policies, even in the liberal Bay Area. Where I live in Oakland, you're seeing the mayor recalled and the district attorney recalled, and that's definitely a pushback on policies involving on public safety. So, in that case, people are losing their jobs.
But in 2016, after Hillary Clinton's loss, there was this whole thing of we're going to do postmortems. The Democratic Party is going to do a full, round of introspection.
Autopsies,
and
yes.
autopsies. We're going to do the whole thing. And I've never seen it,
No.
I don't think that they did. I think that maybe they got some wins after that and thought, oh no, the product is fine. We're going to keep making it and selling it like we have been. And so while it would seem obvious that this is a thing that you need to do, anybody who's ever tried to sell a product can tell you if it's not selling, you need to rethink the product. But here we are, once again, sort of asking why. And it's big, because they continue to double down on, look, voters are not like hiding things. Like, they're telling you what's important. It's the cost of groceries and gas and illegal immigration, and they are yelling it from the rooftops, and yet they're, everyone goes, well, gosh, I just don't know why they don't like us. And you're like, we're trying to tell you. So whether or not they'll listen, I'm not as hopeful as I was in 2016.
This is why also, too, one of the criticisms of Kamala Harris as a candidate, right, was that it was a kind of a policy light campaign. There wasn't a lot of really super developed plans out there, especially on some of the thornier questions. But it's sort of important, now, obviously being at a think tank, I think policy is very important on everything that we do here. But, it's one of those things where the challenge in trying to turn the page from Biden, when you have a 58% disapproval rating, voters had kind of decided at the start, we want to change the administration. So your job is, well, I'm the acceptable person to change the administration too. And a lot of it is inflation, costs, all of these sorts of things. And it's not satisfactory to a voter who's struggling to make ends meet, struggling to afford rising housing costs and afford rising gas prices, to say, hey, the numbers say it's good. You got nothing to worry about. We've gotten past the inflation. All is good. And that's all that they really had to talk about. And so, and even the one real issue that she talked about that was a really developed plan on price gouging, well, I wrote about in my book, if you kind of go through really the issue of price gouging, it's a lot of bad ideas that are going to drive up costs and drive down the availability of supply in grocery stores. So even the one kind of developed plan wouldn't really help your issue of high costs. So you can't be too clever. I don't want to rock the boat too much. You're running for president. You got to say what you're going to do. You got to look people in the eye when they're telling you they're hurting. You got to speak from the heart and say, here's what I'm going to want to do for you. And when you don't do that, you're not going to win those voters you need to win. And you're leaving a big void for your opponent to come in and swoop those voters up for him.
Well, along the lines of some of these issues of what exactly was tipping them off, someone asked, I'm going to paraphrase this, how much do you think Harris's loss and Trump's win had to do with, say, the past, 40 years or so of economic policy and the, greater inequality that's really been baked in, that's really had people where when they get to rents suddenly spiking, that they've got nothing else. That's it. And how much do you think was, race or gender?
Both are true, I think. I think both are true. I mean, it goes back to what voters have been telling us. The rent's too damn high, and the price of food and daily life is too high. And the affordability, we live here in the most expensive area in the world. We know that, but it's a nationwide thing. And also, you can't discount race and gender. We saw some of the most racist and sexist tropes flying around in this campaign, where Trump says, Harris, she just suddenly became black. I mean, what the hell is that? And it's ridiculous. If it wasn't so racist, it's just ignorant, if nothing else. Both are true, I think. And, until America elects a female president or a black female president, but the jury's still out on that.
I think if Kamala Harris was a white guy, she still would have lost. Like, yes, is there racism and sexism? Sure, yeah. But, and I'm not saying that that's not deplorable. But what I'm saying is, if Kamala Harris was Carl Harris and was a white guy, still would have lost. The people don't want to buy what you're selling. At the end of the day, there are people who voted for Obama, who voted for Trump, who voted for, Biden, who voted for Trump. Like, it's not always the deciding thing. It may color people's view, but ultimately it's about rent and food and money. I don't know if there's any studies on that, but I honestly, I think ultimately the Democrats have the wrong policies, and The problem with chalking it up to, not that you did, the problem with chalking it up to racism, sexism is you don't get to the real problem. And so next time you go, oh, well, I'll just run a white guy saying the same stuff, and you're going to lose again.
So with Republicans in control of, let's face it, the Supreme Court, the Senate, the House, and the White House, someone asks kind of like, who is the Democratic Party leader? Is there going to be a big fight for this, or is there someone you think is positioned for that?
Well, we might have a governor who wants to be the Democratic Party leader. I mean, I think you naturally, when you're kind of the out party and that kind of time when you're figuring out where do we go from here and all of that, there's a lot of voices that are vying to be the loudest person in the room. And, I bet you our governor will be one of those people wanting to assert himself. But the 2028 clock starts ticking now. So anyone who's had any thought of ever wanting to be president, they're going to start the stunts and the press conferences and put me on your show and all that. We were joking with a friend which Democrat will come out with, we need to start a petition to stop the effort to amend the Constitution so Trump can run for a third term,
Chuck
which is
Schumer
never going to
already
happen.
got a text.
Did you?
Yeah, from Chuck Schumer.
Seriously?
Personally, I'm sure. But from no, seriously, to sign the petition
Right.
to get Chuck Schumer to pass the No Kings as Tyrants Act or whatever. Yeah, so already. Anyway, I'm not saying Chuck Schumer's going to be the guy. But you could also see Hakeem Jeffries, for example, whose profile has certainly gone up. Even depending on where the party wants to go, somebody like a John Fetterman, who has really been out front and really sort of raised the alarm about what was happening in Pennsylvania in a way that was, not what his party wanted him to say and not what anyone wanted to hear, but ended up being very true. And I think so he's got some credibility based on things like that. So
I think you're right on. Newsom wants to be. There should be like an MSNBC primary. And I think a couple of finalists would be Newsom, because they love him, and Mayor Pete.
Yes.
Mayor Pete,
Yeah.
yes. The Democrats love Mayor Pete. The man who speaks in full paragraphs.
Yes. Yes.
And who has the guts to go on Fox, too.
Yeah.
Right.
And does well there.
And then you got to ask the big question, of course, is what's Kamala Harris's future? Does she, she's got a big list. She raised a record amount of money. So you can, even if you don't raise a lot from that list, that's a lot of money to keep floating and paying for your travels and doing whatever you want to do going forward. Does she want to run again? Does she want to run for some other office?
Yeah.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by the Commonwealth Club World Affairs programs team. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.